Medieval peasants had a 90% winter survival rate, but castle dwellers, nearly 100%. That's not because of wealth or food stores. It's because of three architectural secrets that most historians completely overlook. The third one is so counterintuitive, it sounds like a terrible design until you understand the physics. Medieval castle walls weren't just thick, they were absolutely massive. We're talking 15 to 20 feet of solid stone in some places. That's thick enough to park a small car inside. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Those enormous walls weren't just built to stop arrows and catapults, they were basically giant stone sweaters. The brilliant medieval architects figured out something that would make modern engineers jealous. Stone absorbs heat slowly during the day, then releases it gradually at night. It's like having a massive thermal battery wrapped around your entire home. While you're shivering in your modern house with its paper-thin walls, these medieval folks were enjoying steady, consistent warmth all winter long. But wait, there's a catch. Those same thick walls that kept you toasty also kept you in the dark. Literally. Cut a window through 20 feet of stone and you've basically created a tunnel. The light that manages to squeeze through is about as useful as a flashlight with dying batteries. That's where arrow slits come in. Genius, really. These narrow openings were designed to let archers shoot out while keeping enemies from shooting in. But they serve double duty as the perfect compromise between light and heat loss. Think of them as medieval energy efficiency at its finest. The stone walls acted like a thermos bottle, but one that weighed several thousand tons. During harsh winter storms, while wooden buildings rattled and leaked cold air like sieves, castle inhabitants stayed snug inside their stone cocoons. The walls absorbed whatever weak sunlight managed to peek through the clouds, storing that precious heat for when night fell. And speaking of those walls, some were so ridiculously thick they contained entire secret passages. Imagine explaining that to your modern contractor. Yeah, I'd like walls thick enough to hide a hallway inside. They'd probably recommend therapy instead of construction. Medieval builders also figured out window coverings long before anyone coined the term energy efficient. Heavy wooden shutters, oiled cloth, even thick tapestries, anything to trap heat inside. These weren't exactly Home Depot specials, but they got the job done. Close those shutters at sunset, and you've basically turned your castle into a medieval thermos. Here's what's fascinating. While we obsess over insulation ratings and energy bills today, these medieval folks solved the same problem with nothing but stone, wood, and common sense. Sure, their electric bill was zero, mainly because electricity wouldn't be invented for another few centuries, but their heating strategy was surprisingly sophisticated. The thick walls were just the beginning, though, because once you've trapped all that precious heat inside those stone barriers, you need something to actually generate warmth in the first place. And that's where medieval ingenuity really started to shine. Walking into a medieval castle during winter was like stepping into the world's most inefficient heating system. But at the heart of every castle survival strategy stood something truly magnificent. Fireplaces so massive they could literally roast an entire ox. These weren't your cozy suburban fireplaces where you'd toast marshmallows with the grandkids. We're talking about stone beasts that dominated entire walls, some reaching 8 feet wide and tall enough for a grown man to stand inside. The medieval motto seemed to be, go big or freeze to death. The Great Hall's central hearth served double duty as both heating system and kitchen. Smart, right? Why have two fires when one enormous inferno could handle everything? Castle builders figured this out centuries before modern efficiency experts started lecturing us about energy savings. Then there's the chimney situation. These towering stone stacks weren't just architectural show-offs, they were lifesavers. Without proper ventilation, everyone inside would have been smoked like medieval bacon. The tall chimneys created powerful drafts that sucked smoke and fumes right out of the living spaces. But here's where things get interesting. Some ingenious castle designers went completely overboard with something called in-wall heating flues. Think of it as medieval radiant heating, where warm air traveled through channels built right into the stone walls. It was like having central heating, except it required an army of servants constantly feeding fires and clearing ash. The downside? These massive fireplaces were hungrier than teenagers at a pizza buffet. Keeping them fed meant constant wood gathering, chopping, and hauling. Medieval servants probably got more exercise than modern gym enthusiasts, just trying to keep everyone from turning into human popsicles. Well, the social aspect made these giant hearths even more valuable. Fireplaces became the medieval equivalent of water coolers, gathering spots where families, guests, and servants could huddle together, share warmth, and swap stories. Nothing builds community quite like collectively trying not to freeze. Some castles pushed the envelope further with multiple hearths throughout different rooms. Wealthy lords could afford to heat several spaces simultaneously, while others had to choose their battles, literally picking which rooms deserve warmth on any given day. The really clever part was positioning. Castle architects placed these heating giants strategically, often near interior walls where the warmth could radiate into adjacent rooms. Every BTU counted when you're fighting off winter with nothing but wood, stone, and medieval determination. And the weird part is, despite all this firepower, most castle dwellers still spent their winters bundled up like Arctic explorers indoors. Even with these massive hearths blazing, medieval winter comfort was relative. Speaking of staying warm, these enormous fireplaces were just one piece of the puzzle. The real magic happened when castle designers figured out how to make entire rooms work together as heating systems. Picture walking into a medieval castle's great hall during winter, and you'd immediately understand why these massive rooms weren't just for show. They were basically the medieval equivalent of cranking up the thermostat to maximum, except the thermostat was a room full of people, animals, and whatever heat sources they could manage. The Great Hall served as the castle's heating headquarters. Smart, right? Instead of trying to warm dozens of separate rooms, everyone gathered in one enormous space. Body heat from 50 to several hundred people created a natural furnace that would make your uncle's overly enthusiastic holiday hosting look modest. But here's where medieval architects got clever and slightly impractical. Those soaring ceilings that made great halls so impressive, well, they were about as energy efficient as leaving your front door open in January. Heat rises, and with ceilings reaching 30 feet or more, all that precious warmth headed straight up like it had somewhere important to be. The solution was pure medieval ingenuity. During grand feasts, the combination of human bodies, roasting meat, and blazing hearths turned these halls into surprisingly toasty spaces. Add a few hunting dogs sprawled near the fire and maybe some livestock sheltering indoors, and you've got yourself a medieval heating convention. Then there's the genius of medieval curtain management. When night fell and the crowd thinned out, heavy drapes could section off portions of the hall. Think of it as medieval room dividers, but with the survival skills your grandmother's generation actually possessed. These weren't just decorative, they were literally lifesavers, trapping heat in smaller areas where it could actually do some good. The Great Hall doubled as everyone's bedroom too. Nobles might retreat to private chambers, but servants, guards, and guests bedded down right there on the rush-covered floors. Sounds uncomfortable until you realize they were essentially sleeping in the warmest room in the castle. Not a bad trade-off when the alternative was freezing to death in some distant corner chamber. And the weird part is how these halls became social survival spaces. Shared meals weren't just about food, they were about staying alive. The more people gathered, the warmer everyone stayed. Medieval dinner parties had actual life or death stakes. Of course, cramming hundreds of people into one room created its own problems. The air quality could get pretty questionable, especially with all those bodies, cooking fires, and questionable medieval hygiene standards. But hey, better to smell your neighbors than become a popsicle. The Great Hall's heating strategy worked because it concentrated resources where they'd have maximum impact. Rather than heating the entire castle, they created one reliably warm zone where life could continue normally. But even the most efficiently heated Great Hall couldn't solve every winter challenge. Those sneaky drafts that crept through stone walls required an entirely different approach to medieval comfort. Medieval castle builders knew something your modern contractor probably doesn't. That cold air moves like an uninvited relative at Thanksgiving, finding every possible way to sneak in and make everyone miserable. The difference was, these ancient architects actually did something brilliant about it. Tapestries weren't just fancy wall decorations for showing off how rich you were. Sure, they looked impressive with their intricate stories of knights slaying dragons, but their real job was acting like medieval insulation. These thick, woven masterpieces hung against stone walls, creating an air pocket that trapped warmth better than anything else available. Think of them as the original thermal curtains, except they cost about as much as a small village. But here's where it gets clever. Castle dwellers would close off entire sections during winter months, like your grandmother shutting down half her house to save on heating bills. Unused chambers got sealed with heavy curtains and wooden barriers, concentrating precious heat where people actually lived and worked. Why heat a room nobody's using when firewood costs a fortune? The wealthy folks figured out that layering textiles created maximum warmth retention. They'd hang multiple curtains in doorways, creating airlocks centuries before anyone knew what an airlock was. Some castles had curtains so thick you could practically bounce a coin off them. Well, this system had one annoying side effect nobody talks about in history books. All that draft blocking meant smoke had nowhere to go except straight into people's faces. Medieval folks basically had to choose between freezing to death or slowly suffocating on fireplace fumes. Not exactly what you'd call ideal living conditions. Then there's the ingenious window splays, angled stone recesses around those tiny castle windows. These weren't just architectural eye candy. The angled design created windbreaks that deflected cold air while still allowing some light inside. Medieval engineers understood aerodynamics better than most people realize. Some castles even had double-door systems where you'd pass through two separate doors to enter a room. The space between acted like a buffer zone, preventing cold air from rushing directly inside every time someone entered. Makes sense, right? The really wealthy lords would stuff these draft control spaces with whatever they could find. Old clothes, straw, even animal hides. Basically, if it could block air, it went into service. Your modern weather stripping has nothing on medieval resourcefulness. And the weird part is, many of these textile barriers were removable. During summer months, castle inhabitants could strip away layers of insulation to let cooling breezes flow through. It was like having seasonal climate control, medieval style. But controlling drafts was only part of the heating equation. Smart castle designers knew that where you positioned rooms vertically made all the difference in survival. Ever wonder why medieval lords always seemed to grab the best rooms in the castle? Well, it wasn't just about showing off their fancy titles. They were actually being pretty smart about basic physics. Heat rises, always has, always will. Those medieval architects figured this out faster than a knight could say frozen chainmail. The upper floors of castles stayed significantly warmer than ground-level rooms, making them prime real estate during those brutal winter months. While servants shivered downstairs, nobility enjoyed what was essentially medieval penthouse living. But here's where it gets interesting. The temperature difference between floors could be dramatic. Ground floor rooms might hover just above freezing, while the third floor felt almost cozy by comparison. It's like nature's own elevator system, except instead of going up for a better view, you went up to avoid becoming a human popsicle. Now, this wasn't without its problems. Remember all that smoke we talked about from those massive fireplaces? Well, guess where it ended up? Right alongside all that lovely warm air on the upper levels. Medieval folks basically had to choose between warmth and clean air. Talk about your classic rock and a hard place situation. The clever castle designers worked around this by creating what I like to call a thermal schedule. During daylight hours, residents would often descend to lower floors to take advantage of natural light filtering through those small windows. Makes sense, right? Why waste precious candles when you can squint by a window and stay somewhat productive? Then, as evening approached, everyone would migrate upward like warm-seeking missiles. Here's something that might surprise you. Some castles had guard rooms strategically placed beneath the main living quarters. This wasn't just about security, though I'm sure the guards appreciated being close to their bosses. These occupied lower rooms generated just enough heat from body warmth and small braziers to take the edge off the chill for the floors above. It's medieval crowdsourced heating. The really wealthy families took this vertical heating strategy seriously. They designed entire floor plans around maximizing heat distribution. Bedchambers always went on upper levels, storage got relegated to the cold zones, and common areas found that sweet spot in between. And here's the kicker, this wasn't just about comfort. In a world where pneumonia could kill faster than enemy swords, staying warm meant staying alive. Those upper floor sleeping quarters weren't luxury accommodations. They were survival necessities disguised as status symbols. But even with all this clever use of rising heat, medieval castle dwellers needed more tricks up their sleeves. The stone floors remained brutally cold, turning every barefoot midnight trip into an Arctic expedition. Fortunately, some forward-thinking castle builders had borrowed a few tricks from ancient civilizations that would make even modern homeowners jealous. Here's something that'll blow your mind. While most medieval folks were huddling around smoky fireplaces like cavemen, some clever castle builders were already enjoying heated floors. Talk about being ahead of their time. The Romans had figured out this whole underfloor heating thing centuries earlier with their hippocaust systems. Smart medieval architects basically said, why reinvent the wheel? And borrowed the idea wholesale. These hypocausts worked like ancient central heating, except way more complicated and probably twice as likely to fill your room with smoke. Picture this setup. Stone channels ran beneath the floors, kind of like a maze for hot air. Fires would burn in special furnaces, sending heated air and smoke through these underground passages. The stone slabs above would warm up gradually, turning your floor into a giant heating pad. Genius, right? Well, mostly genius. The downside? These systems were about as expensive as buying a Tesla with gold-plated hubcaps. Only the wealthiest lords could afford to install and maintain them. Plus, if something went wrong with the channels, you'd need to tear up half your floor to fix it. Makes modern plumbing problems look like child's play. But when they worked properly, hippocausts were absolutely magical. Imagine walking barefoot across warm stone floors while snow piled up outside your windows. Your feet would stay toasty, and the gentle heat radiating upward kept the chill at bay without all that smoke from regular fireplaces. Then there's the unexpected bonus feature. Those secret underground passages that castle designers loved so much. These tunnels often ran close to heated rooms or even shared space with the hippocaust channels. So not only could you sneak around undetected, you could do it in relative comfort. Nothing says medieval spy like a warm, hidden corridor. The heated stone acted like a thermal battery, storing warmth during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. This meant fewer middle-of-the-night wake-up calls to stoke fires. Your servants could actually get some sleep instead of playing firefighter every few hours. Unfortunately, hippocausts were rarer than hen's teeth in medieval castles. The complexity and cost meant most nobles stuck with their giant fireplaces and hoped for the best. Today, finding a castle with surviving hippocaust remains is like discovering buried treasure. Archaeologists get genuinely excited about ancient heating ducts. The few examples we can still examine show sophisticated engineering that wouldn't look out of place in a modern radiant heating system. These medieval innovators understood heat distribution better than most people realize. But here's what's really fascinating. Even the fanciest heated floors couldn't solve every winter problem. The people living in these castles had to get creative with something else entirely to stay warm during those brutal months. Medieval castle dwellers understood something that modern folks seem to have forgotten. Your clothes are basically your personal heating system. And trust me, they took this job more seriously than a grandmother checking if you're warm enough before leaving the house. Wool became the superstar of medieval fashion, but not because it looked good. This stuff worked like nature's own insulation system. The fibers trapped air between them, creating tiny pockets of warmth that stayed put even when the castle felt colder than a mother-in-law's stare. Smart medieval people wore wool in layers, sometimes 3 or 4 different pieces stacked on top of each other. But here's where it gets interesting. They didn't just throw on random layers like we might grab whatever's clean from the laundry basket. Medieval layering was strategic warfare against the cold. The base layer sat close to skin, made from fine wool or linen. Then came the middle layers for bulk and warmth. Finally, the outer layer provided protection from wind and moisture. Furs took luxury to another level entirely. Bear pelts, wolf skins, and rabbit fur-lined cloaks and boots. The wealthy basically walked around wearing entire ecosystems on their backs. A single ermine-lined cloak could cost more than a peasant's annual income. Imagine paying a year's salary for a winter coat today. Then there's the genius of medieval tailoring that modern fashion completely ignores. Hoods weren't just decorative, they formed complete head coverage systems. Muffs kept hands functional while staying warm. Some garments featured fur-lined pockets that doubled as hand warmers. Medieval people basically turned themselves into walking sleeping bags, but somehow managed to look dignified doing it. The real challenge wasn't just staying warm, though, it was staying mobile. Try swinging a sword while wearing 4 layers of wool and a fur cloak. Makes you appreciate why medieval warriors looked so bulky in those old paintings. Half their size came from winter survival gear. While maintaining all this fancy layering required serious resources, shepherds worked year-round to provide wool. Skilled weavers turned raw materials into usable fabric. Furriers prepared and fitted animal pelts. An entire economy revolved around keeping people from freezing to death in their own homes. The wealthy could afford multiple sets of layered clothing, changing when pieces got wet or dirty. Poor folks made do with fewer layers and had to be more careful about maintaining what they owned. Getting your only warm cloak soaked could literally be life-threatening. But here's what really strikes me about medieval clothing strategy. It perfectly mirrored their architectural approach to surviving winter. Both relied on trapping warm air, creating barriers against cold, and using thick materials to maintain temperature. The castle provided the shell, but clothing created the personal microclimate that actually kept people alive through those brutal medieval winters.